Somewhere around 3,200 years before Christ, on a flat, treeless plain in southern Mesopotamia, a scribe pressed a sharpened reed into a lump of wet clay and left a mark that no one alive could read for the next 5,000 years. That mark was not poetry, it was not prayer, it was a record of barley rations, and it was made in a city called Uruk, a city of perhaps 40,000 souls at a time when most human settlements on earth held a few hundred. This is the place that invented writing, not to tell stories, but to count grain. And here is the detail that sounds impossible, but is confirmed by decades of German excavation. Archaeologists have pulled tens of thousands of small, crude, mass-produced clay bowls from the ruins of this single city. Beveled rim bowls, each one roughly the same size, each one likely a standardized container for a daily ration of barley. A city so large, so organized, that it fed its workers with the ancient equivalent of a factory-stamped lunch tray. Yet the same irrigation system that grew that barley was quietly depositing salt into the soil, season after season, century after century. The question the whole film asks is simple and enormous. What happens when the very engine that builds a civilization is also the thing destroying it, so slowly that no one alive in any single generation can see it happening? This is the complete biography of Uruk, the full life of the world's first great city, from its first breath to its last, and beyond. We begin long before any wall existed, around 5,000 years before Christ, when scattered reed huts along shifting Euphrates channels housed families who fished the marshes and planted the first irrigated barley. We will watch those villages merge, drawn together by two sacred precincts, one for the sky god Anu, one for the goddess Inanna, until the settlement crosses a threshold no human community had ever crossed before, and becomes something new under the sun. A city. We will see the engine that powered it, temple institutions collecting surplus grain and redistributing it through a bureaucracy so complex it required the invention of written symbols to function. We will stand inside the Iana precinct when its limestone temple walls gleam with cone mosaics, tens of thousands of painted clay cones pressed into wet plaster, red, white, and black, catching torchlight. We will walk the streets at dawn when bread ovens smoke, and canal water glints, and weavers card wool in temple workshops. We will read the Wakavas, a single meter of carved alabaster that depicts the entire economic cycle of the city, from water to grain to livestock to the goddess herself. We will meet the legendary Gilgamesh, and then we will separate what the epic claims from what the mud brick and the tablets actually prove. We will trace the centuries of conquest, Sargon of Akkad taking the city, Utu-Hegal briefly winning it back, the long quiet centuries when Uruk shrank inside its own vast walls. We will follow the astronomers of the Seleucid Age, scholars who tracked planets and predicted eclipses from temple rooftops in a city whose neighborhoods were already emptying. And we will witness the end, not a dramatic siege, not a fire, but a river shifting its course westward, canals silting shut, families leaving one by one, until the ziggurat stood alone against the sky and the desert buried everything. What makes Uruk irreplaceable is not simply its age. It is that this city asked every question we still ask about urban life. How do you feed a population too large to feed itself? How do you record obligations too complex for memory? How do you organize strangers into cooperation? Every city on Earth today inherits answers that were first attempted here, in mud brick, in wet clay, in canal water carried across a plain so flat you could see the horizon in every direction. The myth gave us Gilgamesh. The excavation gave us something more extraordinary. The actual city, measurable, readable, and still not fully understood. If you value complete journeys through the great cities of antiquity, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Each time, we bring one legendary city back to life, from its first wall to its last stone. Let us begin where every city begins, with the land itself, long before the first hearth, when the Euphrates wandered freely across a plain that no one yet imagined could hold the largest settlement on earth. There is no stone here, no hill to fortify, no cliff to shelter against, no natural harbor where deep water meets the shore. There is only flatness, an immense, heat-shimmering plain of alluvial silt stretching south and east toward the marshes where the Euphrates loses itself before reaching the sea. The land is younger than it looks. For millennia, the river has carried sediment down from the mountains of eastern Anatolia, depositing it grain by grain across southern Mesopotamia, building the ground itself. By roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era, this plain is less than 2 meters above the water table in most places. Dig a shallow pit and it fills. Cut a channel from the river and water flows where you send it. This is the secret. Not defense, not altitude, not a mineral vein in the rock, water that can be moved. The Euphrates here splits into braided channels, and between them the soil is dark, fine-grained, and deep. Barley planted in this earth after the spring flood yields more than rain-fed agriculture can produce anywhere in the ancient Near East. 1 hectare of irrigated alluvial field can feed several families. The surplus is small at first, measured in baskets, but it is real, and it is the reason anyone stays. The earliest occupation layers at the site the modern world calls Warka, the mounds that cover ancient Uruk, date to the Ubaid period, roughly 5,000 to 4,000 years before the Common Era. German excavators cutting deep trenches in the 20th century found characteristic Ubaid pottery. Buff-colored, painted with dark geometric patterns, identical in style to sherds recovered from sites across southern Mesopotamia and as far as the Gulf Coast. These are not yet city people. They live in clusters of reed houses, the walls made from bundled marsh reeds tied and bent into arches, plastered with river mud. A building technique still practiced in the Iraqi marshes 5,000 years later. 2 separate clusters matter. One gathers around a precinct that later generations will call Iana, the House of Heaven, sacred to the goddess who will be known as Inanna. The other forms roughly 700 meters to the west, around a raised platform dedicated to Anu, the sky god. These are not yet temples in any monumental sense. Mud brick platforms perhaps a meter high, small shrines atop them, places where offerings of grain and animal fat are left. But they are fixed points. People return to them, rebuild on the same spot, raise the platform slightly higher each generation. The archaeology shows continuous occupation, layer pressed upon layer. Between and around these 2 cult centers, families dig irrigation ditches by hand. The tools are simple: wooden digging sticks, reed baskets for moving earth. A channel 1 meter wide and half a meter deep, running 200 meters from a river branch to a field, can be cut by a small group in days. But it must be maintained every season. Silt fills it. banks erode. The work never ends, and it binds people to place more tightly than any wall. The population is modest, perhaps a few hundred across scattered hamlets. No one writes because writing does not exist. No one rules in any formal sense that the archaeological record can detect. But the grain comes in, more than enough, and the surplus must be stored, guarded, and divided. The mud brick platforms grow a little wider. The reed houses press a little closer together. The ditches reach a little farther from the river. By 4,000 years before the Common Era, the settlements around Iana and the Anu precinct have grown dense enough that the open ground between them is filling in. Something is pulling people inward: the shared irrigation network, the cult centers, the stored grain, or all three at once. No single founder decides this. No king orders it. The river proposes, and the people who dig its channels into their fields answer with the only currency they have: labor, season after season, pressed into mud. The reeds still bend in the southern wind. The canals still carry brown water toward the barley rows. But in the layers of earth beneath Waka, the transition is already recorded. Not in words, not yet, but in the thickening mud brick, the widening platforms, and the steady accumulation of grain that will demand, within centuries, an invention no one can yet imagine. The grain is what changes everything, not the seed itself. Barley has grown along these channels for 1,000 years, but the quantity. Sometime after 4,000 before the Common Era, the fields around the Iana and Kulab districts begin producing more than the families who plant them can eat. The surplus is small at first, perhaps a few hundred liters stored in clay-lined pits near the temple platforms. But surplus, once it exists, demands decisions. Who stores it? Who counts it? Who distributes it when the flood comes late and the fields dry out? The temples answer. The Iana precinct, already sacred ground for generations, begins to grow upward and outward. Mud brick platforms are widened, leveled, and raised again, each rebuilding adding roughly a meter of height, each layer packed with the rubble of the one before. By 3800 before the Common Era, the platform supports a structure large enough to require coordinated labor from hundreds of workers over months. The bricks are plano-convex, flat on one side and curved on the other, shaped by hand and dried in the relentless sun. No kiln yet. The heat of southern Mesopotamia does the work for free. The settlement area expands. Archaeological survey estimates suggest that the inhabited zone grows from perhaps 40 hectares to over 100 during these centuries, drawing in surrounding villages whose populations migrate toward the center. The open ground between Iana and Kulab fills with courtyard houses, narrow lanes, animal pens, and bread ovens. The smell of the place thickens. Sheep dung drying for fuel, wet clay from fresh construction, barley porridge cooking in the early morning, canal water standing warm in shallow ditches between houses. What pulls them inward is not a wall. There is no wall yet. It is the infrastructure of survival. The canal network feeding these fields requires collective maintenance. Channels must be dredged before each planting season, breaches repaired after storms, water divided among competing plots. The temple institution, centered on the cult of Inanna at Iana, becomes the organizing authority. Not a government in any modern sense, more a permanent household whose granaries and labor roles give it gravitational weight. Small clay tokens, spheres, cones, discs, each shape representing a commodity or quantity, appear in the archaeological record of this period. They are not writing, but they are counting, and counting is the first step. The landscape around the growing settlement is not wilderness, it is engineered earth. Canals branch from the main Euphrates channel in a pattern visible from above as a kind of nervous system, each smaller channel feeding a block of fields, each field bordered by low earthen berms to hold water during controlled flooding. A single season of neglect can collapse the system. Silt fills an uncleared channel in months, and the fields it fed turn to cracked hardpan. The labor is endless, seasonal, and non-negotiable. By 3500 before the Common Era, the Iana precinct includes structures built with a sophistication that no village could organize. Walls are decorated with clay cones pressed into wet plaster, the earliest examples of the cone mosaic technique that will later dazzle visitors to the great temples. Limestone blocks appear, carried from outcrops more than 60 kilometers to the west, implying not just trade, but organized transport. Boats on the river, teams of laborers at the landing, oxen dragging sledges across the plain. The population is impossible to count precisely. Estimates range from several thousand to perhaps 10,000, modest by later standards, but unprecedented on Earth at this moment. No other settlement anywhere approaches this density, this coordination, this architectural ambition. The people living here do not know they are building the first city. They know only that the grain must be counted, the canals must be dug, the temple platform must rise another course of brick before the rains, and that the life they are making together cannot be unmade without unmaking all of them. The tokens multiply in the storerooms, the platforms climb, and somewhere in the temple precinct, someone is about to press a reed into wet clay, not to count, but to record, though that threshold still lies a few centuries ahead, gathering like pressure behind a door. The door opens, not with a single stroke, not in a single season, but across generations of pressure, the slow, compounding weight of surplus that outgrows every method devised to track it. By 3,500 years before the Common Era, the settlement that has been swelling around the Iana precinct crosses a threshold no human community has crossed before. The population climbs past 20,000, then 30, then, by the estimates archaeologists will later argue over with honest uncertainty, somewhere toward 40,000 or beyond. The fields stretching along the canal networks now produce more barley than anyone can hold in memory. And memory at last is not enough. The tokens that filled the temple storerooms for centuries, small clay shapes representing measures of grain, heads of cattle, jars of oil, begin to fail under their own success. When a storehouse holds 10 sealed containers, a handful of tokens suffices. When it holds hundreds, when labor crews number in the thousands, when wool shipments arrive from districts half a day's walk away, the system buckles. Someone, no name survives, no face, no story, presses the end of a cut reed into a palm-sized cushion of wet clay and leaves a mark. Then another. Then a row of marks beside a pictograph scratched with a stylus point. A sheaf of barley, a number, a container. The tablet dries in the sun. It can be stored, retrieved, checked, disputed. It does not roll loose in a jar. It does not lie. This is not literature. It is not prayer. It is accounting, and it changes everything. the archaic tablets recovered from the Iana precinct number roughly 5,000. Their signs, approximately 1,200 distinct symbols, record barley allotments, beer distributions, livestock tallies, land measurements, and the organization of labor gangs. A single tablet might document that a specific quantity of grain moved from a storehouse to a brewing operation, or that a team of workers received their daily ration. The system is not alphabetic, not phonetic in any complete sense. It is a technology of institutional memory, built to serve the temple economy that feeds the city. And that economy now operates at staggering scale. The beveled rim bowl becomes its most visible artifact, a rough, thick-walled vessel, mass-produced by pressing clay into molds, found by the tens of thousands in excavation layers across the late Uruk period. These bowls hold approximately 8/10 of a liter, close to the daily barley ration documented on the tablets for a common laborer. They are not fine pottery. They are disposable containers for a standardized payment, the physical residue of a system that feeds thousands of workers daily from centralized stores. The storerooms themselves fill the Iana precinct, sealed jars marked with cylinder seal impressions, their clay stoppers recording the authority that closed them and the contents within. The smell inside these rooms is dry grain and dust and bitumen sealant. Outside, the precinct hums with coordinated labor, weavers producing woolen textiles in temple workshops, potters turning out ration bowls in open yards, canal crews dragging baskets of silt from waterways that must be cleared before every planting season. Each of these activities generates a tablet, a record, a small rectangle of clay that enters the archive. The city is now exporting its system along with its goods. Uruk-style pottery, beveled rim bowls, and administrative practices appear at sites across Upper Mesopotamia into southeastern Anatolia and along trade routes reaching toward the Iranian plateau. Lapis lazuli arrives from the mountains of distant Badakhshan. Copper comes from Oman or the highland regions to the east. The temple collects, records, redistributes, and in doing so, invents bureaucracy as a technology of survival. Yet every tablet also records a dependency. The population that has gathered inside and around these walls cannot feed itself without the system that counts its grain, assigns its labor, and maintains its canals. The wet clay dries. The reed stylus wears down and is replaced. And the fields that make all of this possible drink their seasonal water, leaving behind, in the topsoil, a faint white residue that no tablet records and no scribe yet thinks to count. The faint white residue will wait, for now the city is building upward, and the scale of what it raises from the mud has no precedent anywhere on Earth. Sometime around 3300 before the Common Era, the Iana precinct enters a phase of construction so ambitious that the German excavators who uncovered it nearly 5,000 years later struggled to believe the dates their own stratigraphy demanded. On a platform of packed earth and mud brick, workers raise the limestone temple, a structure roughly 80 meters long, its walls faced not with the local clay, but with blocks of pale limestone hauled from quarries more than 60 kilometers to the west, across open plain, without wheeled carts or draft horses. The logistics alone imply an organized labor force numbering in the thousands, fed daily from temple granaries, each worker receiving roughly 1 liter of barley and a measure of oil. The limestone is extraordinary, but it is the clay cones that define this skyline. Tens of thousands of them, small finger-length pegs of fired clay, their flat heads painted red, white, or black, are pressed into wet mud plaster across the facades and columns of the Eanna temples. The effect, when torchlight catches the surface, is a shimmering geometric mosaic. Zigzags, diamonds, lozenges, running in bands across walls and around the massive columns of the pillar hall, where freestanding pillars nearly 3 meters in diameter stand in rows, each one a mud brick core wrapped entirely in these tiny colored cones. No earlier architecture anywhere attempts decoration at this density or scale. The labor is staggering to calculate. A single square meter of cone mosaic requires hundreds of individual cones, each shaped, fired, painted, and pressed into place by hand. The pillar hall alone, with its rows of enormous columns and its mosaic-covered walls, consumed tens of thousands of worker days. And the Eanna precinct contains not one such building, but several, rebuilt and expanded across generations: the stone cone temple, the Great Hall, structures labeled by excavators with letter because their original names are lost. What feeds this construction is the same engine that now demands a new technology. The temple collects more grain, more wool, more labor than any human memory can track. Somewhere in the administrative rooms of the Eanna, around 3200 before the Common Era, scribes begin pressing the tips of cut reeds into small cushions of wet clay, leaving marks that are no longer simple tokens or seal impressions, but signs, abstract, repeating, combinable. The archaic tablets of Uruk, roughly 5,000 of which survive, record quantities of barley, counts of livestock, allocations of beer and bread, lists of titles and professions. They are not literature. They are not prayers. They are accounting, the world's first writing, born not from poetry, but from the need to track how many beveled rim bowls of grain were distributed to how many workers on which day. Those bowls appear everywhere the excavators dig. Coarse, undecorated, mass-produced in molds rather than shaped on wheels, the beveled rim bowl is the most common artifact in all of Uruk period archaeology. Its standardized volume, roughly 0.8 of a liter, matches the daily barley ration recorded on the tablets. The bowl is the ration. Thousands of them, broken and discarded in middens across the city, mark the residue of a system that feeds a population now estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 people, a density of human settlement that no village structure could administer. The cone mosaics gleam. The tablets dry in the sun and are filed in archive rooms. The bowls are filled, emptied, and broken by the thousands. And the system that links all three, surplus collected, recorded, redistributed, is now so complex that it requires a class of specialists who do nothing but maintain it. The scribes, working with a repertoire of roughly 1,200 distinct signs, managing the metabolism of the largest settlement on Earth. The city has crossed a threshold. It no longer merely stores grain. It writes its own existence into clay, and in doing so becomes legible to itself and to every century that follows. Outside the precinct walls, in the residential quarters, mud brick houses crowd along narrow, unpaved lanes. Bread smoke rises from courtyard ovens at dawn. Canal water is carried in ceramic jars. And from the temple rooftop, looking south across the plain, the shimmer of irrigated fields stretches unbroken to the horizon, green, productive, and quietly accumulating in every furrow the mineral cost of its own abundance. That mineral cost is invisible to the people who walk these streets. What they see instead is something unprecedented rising from the alluvial mud, a skyline. Not the low roof lines of villages, not the modest platforms of earlier generations, but towering facades sheathed in color, temples whose walls catch the southern light in patterns of red, white, and black, visible from the fields a kilometer away. The Iana precinct is being rebuilt on a scale that dwarfs everything before it. The limestone temple, so named by its excavators millennia later, stands on a raised platform and measures roughly 76 meters in length, its walls constructed not of the usual sun-dried mud brick alone, but faced with blocks of limestone hauled from quarries more than 60 kilometers to the west. No wheel assists this transport. No draft animal native to the plain can pull stone of this weight across soft alluvial soil. The blocks arrive by water, floated on reed rafts down tributary channels, then dragged on sledges the final distance to the precinct. The labor is staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the monumental buildings of this period required tens of thousands of person-days per structure, organized, fed, and directed by the same temple bureaucracy whose tablets track barley rations down to the individual worker. But limestone is rare. The signature material of this skyline is humbler and stranger, small cones of fired clay, each roughly the length of a human hand, their flat heads dipped in red, white, or black pigment. Workers press them by the tens of thousands into thick layers of wet mud plaster, coating the temple walls and columns. The result is a mosaic surface of geometric patterns, zigzags, diamonds, lozenges, chevrons, that transforms raw mud brick into something shimmering and almost textile in appearance. The technique solves two problems simultaneously. It protects the vulnerable mud surface from rain and wind erosion, and it declares, in pure visual spectacle, that this building belongs to a different order of existence than the houses crowding the lanes below. The pillar hall stands nearby, its massive columns, some nearly 2.5 meters in diameter, entirely sheathed in these cone mosaics. The columns are not structural in the way stone columns will be in later civilizations. They are mud brick cores wrapped in decoration, monuments to the sheer volume of coordinated labor the temple commands. Excavators from the German expedition beginning in 1912 found cone fragments by the hundreds of thousands in the Iana debris layers, enough to confirm that this was not occasional ornament, but industrial-scale production. Inside the precinct, the spaces are vast and dim. Torchlight catches the mosaic surfaces and throws shifting geometric shadows across plastered floors. The smell is mud and bitumen, the black, naturally occurring petroleum tar used to waterproof foundations and seal joints between bricks. Bitumen arrives from seeps near Hit, far upstream, another commodity flowing down the river network into the city's insatiable construction economy. Beyond the precinct walls, the residential city spreads across an area approaching 2.5 square kilometers. Houses are modest, mud brick rooms arranged around small courtyards, roofed with palm trunks and reed matting. The contrast with the temples is absolute and deliberate. The surplus that feeds the city flows upward, concentrating in sacred architecture that grows taller and more elaborate with each rebuilding phase. Archaeologists count multiple construction layers in the Iana precinct from this period alone, each new temple raised on the leveled remains of its predecessor, each grander than the last. And something else is taking shape in these decades around 3000 before the Common Era. In the same precinct where cones are pressed into wet plaster and limestone blocks are wrestled into place, a sculptor is working a block of white marble, not local stone, almost certainly imported, into a face. It is slightly smaller than life-size, flat at the back, as if meant to be mounted on a wall or fitted to a wooden body. The eyes are hollow, once inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli or coloured stone. The brow is calm. The lips carry the faintest suggestion of composure. When the German team uncovers it in 1939, they will call it the Mask of Walker, and it will become one of the oldest known naturalistic representations of a human face. Whether it depicts Inanna herself or a high priestess remains uncertain. What is certain is that the city capable of producing it commands not only labor and grain, but artistic skill of an order that will not be surpassed in Mesopotamia for centuries. Nearby, wrapped in the same debris layers, another object waits, a tall vessel of carved alabaster whose surface tells the entire story of what this city believes itself to be. The vessel stands just over 1 meter tall, carved from a single block of translucent alabaster, and its surface carries the most complete visual statement any city on Earth has yet made about itself. Found in the Iana precinct in 1933 and 34 by the German excavation team, broken into fragments and carefully reassembled, the Walker vase dates to approximately 3100 before the Common Era, the very moment when Uruk's institutional engine is running at full capacity. Read it from the bottom upward, the way water rises from the earth. The lowest register shows 2 carved bands, a wavy line representing water, and above it, alternating stalks of barley and date palms growing from that water. This is the foundation, the Euphrates channeled into fields, the irrigation that makes everything above it possible. The next register carries a procession of rams and ewes walking in profile, their wool thick, their bodies well fed. Grain feeds animals. Animals produce wool, milk, meat. The surplus economy is being described in stone with the clarity of an accounting ledger. The third register is where the city appears. Naked male figures stride forward in a line, each carrying a vessel or basket overflowing with produce, fruits, grain, liquids in handled jars. These are the laborers, the canal diggers, the field workers, the men whose daily ration of roughly 1 liter of barley purchases their strength for the temple's use. They carry the surplus upward, toward the final and tallest register. At the top stands a female figure, almost certainly Inanna or her high priestess, receiving the offerings before the symbols of the goddess, reed bundle standards that mark her sacred precinct. Behind her, storage vessels and ritual objects crowd the scene. The entire agricultural cycle, water to grain to animal to labor to offering to divine authority, is compressed into 4 horizontal bands on a single carved surface. No written text accompanies the images. None is needed. The vase is its own language, and what it says is this: the city exists because surplus flows upward, from earth to goddess, and the goddess guarantees that the water keeps flowing downward. This is not decoration. It is theology fused with economics, carved into a vessel likely used in the ritual processions that marked the sacred calendar, perhaps the great festival of Inanna that later texts describe in detail. The alabaster itself had to be quarried and transported from outcrops at least 60 kilometers to the west, shaped with tools of flint and copper, and polished to a translucence that catches lamplight. The labor embedded in this single object, quarrying, transport, carving, finishing, represents weeks of specialized work by artisans whose skill the temple feeds and houses. Together, the vase and the mask found nearby reveal something essential about Uruk at the turn of the 3rd millennium. This is a city that has moved beyond mere survival into self-representation. It possesses the surplus, the institutional structure, and the artistic vocabulary to depict its own cosmic order, and to do so with a sophistication that assumes its audience already understands the hierarchy being shown. The laborers know they carry grain upward. The priestess knows she stands at the summit. The goddess guarantees the cycle. Yet carved into the same alabaster, invisible to the artisan's eye, is the question the vase cannot answer. The water at the bottom of the register is not limitless. Each season it deposits a faint mineral residue in the soil it feeds. The barley still grows. The rams still fatten. The procession still climbs toward the goddess. But somewhere beyond the frame of this perfect carved world, in fields stretching south and east toward the marshes, the white crust is thickening, season by season, and the yields that sustain this entire vertical order have already begun their imperceptible retreat. Inside the walls, no one measures that retreat. What the city measures instead is something new, its own history. Across the decades following the vase's creation, as the early dynastic period takes shape around 3000 before the Common Era, scribes begin compiling lists of kings who ruled before living memory. The names they record for Uruk's first dynasty will echo for millennia: Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and a king called Gilgamesh, to whom tradition will attribute the massive mud-brick wall circuit now enclosing the city. Those walls stretch 9.5 kilometers around 5.5 square kilometers of urban ground, studded with roughly 900 semicircular towers. Whether Gilgamesh built them, or whether the walls accumulated across generations and a legendary king received the credit, the archaeological record cannot yet say. What it can say is that by this period, the walls exist, the city they enclose is among the largest on earth, and somewhere inside them, a scribe is pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, recording a name that will outlast every mud-brick tower standing above him. Dawn arrives the way it always does on the alluvial plain, not gradually, but as a sudden flattening of shadow, the sun clearing the eastern horizon and striking the mud-brick walls until they glow the color of warm bread. Inside those walls, somewhere near the Iana precinct, a tanure oven has been firing since before first light. The baker, or more precisely the household that bakes, feeds dried sheep dung and reed bundles into the cylindrical clay oven, slaps rounds of barley dough against its inner walls, and waits. The smell carries through the narrow lanes, mixing with canal water, animal pens, and the faintly acrid dust of mud brick slowly weathering in the dry air. This is Uruk in the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2600 years before the Common Era. The city holds an estimated 40,000 people, perhaps more, packed into courtyard compounds of sun-dried brick that excavation reveals as modest rectangles, most between 30 and 60 square meters of roofed space, organized around an open court where cooking, grinding, and weaving happen in shared light. Walls stand thick enough to hold the heat out by day and in by night. Rooms are small, windowless or nearly so, cooled by the courtyard draught. The ration system still anchors daily survival. A laborer attached to the temple institution receives roughly 1 liter of barley per day, enough for bread and beer but little else. Oil, perhaps 1 or 2 liters per month. Wool, a set allotment per year, enough for a single garment. Senior administrators and skilled workers receive multiples of this base ration, documented on clay tablets that survive by the hundreds. The beveled rim bowl appears everywhere, crude, mass-produced, undecorated, found shattered in refuse layers by the tens of thousands. Its standardized volume, roughly 3/4 of a liter, matches the daily grain measure almost exactly. These are not fine pottery. They are institutional infrastructure, shaped quickly in molds, used once or twice, discarded. Yet the ration economy does not account for everything. Canal-side areas show concentrations of activity that suggest informal exchange. Fish brought in from the southern marshes, dates carried from palm groves beyond the walls, reed bundles for fuel and construction. Not every transaction passes through temple ledgers. The city is too large, too dense, too various for any single institution to feed and clothe every mouth within its circuit. In the textile workshops attached to the Iana precinct, women card raw wool, spin thread on hand spindles, and weave on horizontal looms. Administrative tablets from comparable Sumerian cities document workshop outputs with startling precision. So many workers, so many days, so many lengths of cloth. The textiles produced here are not only for local use. Wool cloth is among Uruk's most valuable exports, traded upriver and across the Gulf for copper, timber, and stone that the alluvial plain cannot provide. Children in this city learn by proximity. A potter's child watches bowls shaped by the thousand. A scribe's apprentice begins copying sign lists on practice tablets, small round exercises that archaeologists find discarded near institutional buildings, covered in wobbly repetitions of the same cuneiform signs. Literacy remains rare, a specialized skill belonging to the temple and palace administration, but the knowledge it records, grain counts, land measurements, ritual calendars, organizes the labor of tens of thousands who will never read a single sign. By midday the lanes fall quiet. Heat presses down on the rooftops where families sleep in summer. Canal water moves sluggishly through channels cut beneath the streets, carrying waste toward the fields where it serves double duty as fertilizer and irrigation. The system is ingenious and fragile. A blocked canal means standing water, insects, disease. The density that makes the city powerful also makes it vulnerable in ways no village ever was. As afternoon shadows lengthen, the Iana precinct prepares for evening offerings. Barley, dates, sheep, the same surplus that feeds the city feeds its goddess. Inanna's cult sustains the institutional framework that collects and distributes, and the framework sustains the cult. Neither exists without the other. Somewhere in a storeroom, a scribe tallies the day's receipts, pressing a reed stylus into damp clay, recording numbers that will outlast the bread, the wool, the canal water, and the city itself. Outside the walls, white crusts are forming along the edges of the oldest irrigated fields. Those white crusts do not wash away. Each season, canal water drawn from the Euphrates carries dissolved minerals onto the fields: calcium, magnesium, sodium. The sun bakes the surface at temperatures exceeding 40 degrees, pulling moisture upward through capillary action and leaving the salts behind like a thin mineral scar. One season means nothing. 10 seasons mean little. But by 2600 before the Common Era, generations of irrigation have been depositing this residue across the oldest cultivated land surrounding Uruk, and the cumulative effect is becoming measurable in what the fields will and will not grow. The evidence is preserved not in poetry but in accounting. Administrative texts from southern Mesopotamian cities during this period document a slow, unmistakable shift. Wheat, which once shared the crop registers equally with barley, begins to disappear. Wheat is the more sensitive grain. It falters when soil salinity rises above a modest threshold. Barley tolerates roughly twice the salt concentration. Field by field, season by season, temple administrators record what the land is telling them. The wheat yields drop, the barley holds, and so the fields that once fed Uruk bread from 2 grains increasingly feed it from 1. This is the bargain the river offered from the beginning. Irrigation created the surplus that built the temples, invented writing, and concentrated 40,000 people behind mud-brick walls. But the same water, spread across the same flat plain with no natural drainage to flush the accumulating salts, is slowly poisoning the contract. Yields per hectare decline, not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that the margin between surplus and sufficiency narrows. The temple storerooms still fill, but they fill a little less generously than they did 3 centuries earlier. The political consequences arrive on schedule. Southern Mesopotamia by 2400 before the Common Era is not one city but a constellation of rivals. Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, Eridu, each dependent on the same branching river system, each needing more water as their own fields degrade. Canal headwaters become strategic assets. A city that controls an upstream diversion point can starve its downstream neighbor without ever raising an army. The border dispute between Lagash and Umma over the Guedena, a fertile district between them, produces some of the earliest documented interstate conflicts, recorded on monuments like the Stele of the Vultures. Water rights and field boundaries are carved in stone because they are worth fighting over. Uruk, once unchallenged in scale, now competes within this system. Its walls still stand, 9.5 kilometers of mud brick circuit, roughly 900 towers, but walls do not grow barley. The city remains a prestigious cult center, Inanna's sacred seat, yet political gravity shifts toward whoever controls the most productive land and the most reliable canals. Around 2340 before the Common Era, that someone is Lugalzagesi, king of Umma. He conquers city after city across Sumer, and he chooses Uruk, not Umma, as his capital, precisely because its ancient prestige legitimizes his rule. His votive inscriptions, found at the Temple of Enlil in Nippur, claim dominion from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He styles himself King of Uruk and King of the land. For perhaps 25 years, the old city serves once more as a seat of power, its temples receiving royal endowments, its name carried across the plain on diplomatic correspondence. But Lugalzagesi's unification is fragile, held together by military momentum rather than institutional depth. To the north, in the city of Akkad, a man named Sargon is assembling an army drawn from beyond the traditional Sumerian heartland. The inscriptions will later record that Sargon defeated Lugal-Zaggisi, brought him to Nippur in a neck stock, and dismantled his brief empire. Uruk's walls, the ones legend credits to Gilgamesh, do not prevent what comes next. The gates open, whether by siege, by betrayal, or by negotiation, the sources do not agree, and for the first time, the city passes into the hands of a power whose language is not Sumerian and whose capital lies far to the north. Dust rises from the roads leading out of the city as a new administration arrives to take inventory of the granaries. The new administrators speak Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that sounds nothing like the Sumerian still murmured in the Eanna precinct's inner courts. But the temples do not close. Sargon understands what every conqueror of southern Mesopotamia must learn quickly. The grain flows because the temples organize it, and the temples function because the people believe in them. Dismantle the Eanna and the surplus collapses, so the compound stays. Sargon's daughter Enheduanna is installed as high priestess of the moon god at Ur, and Akkadian governors take residence in Uruk. But the cult of Inanna continues its festivals, its wool collections, its barley distributions. The beveled rim bowls keep emerging from the kilns. What changes is sovereignty. For the first time in its existence, Uruk answers to a capital it cannot see from its walls. The city of Akkad, whose precise location remains unknown even to modern archaeology, draws tribute northward: grain, textiles, laborers for royal construction projects. Uruk's scribes begin writing in Akkadian alongside Sumerian, and administrative tablets from this period show a bilingual bureaucracy managing the same irrigation canals, the same flocks, the same temple lands, but now reporting upward to an imperial apparatus. The Akkadian Empire holds for roughly a century and a half. When it fractures after the reign of Shah Khalishari around 2190 before the Common Era, the vacuum fills with chaos. The Sumerian sources speak of the Gutians, highland people from the Zagros, whose incursions disrupt trade routes and destabilize the plain. Later literary tradition portrays them as barbarians, though the reality was likely more complex, raiding parties and opportunistic warlords rather than a unified occupation. It is from Uruk that the response comes. Around 2119 before the Common Era, a man named Utu-Hegal rallies the city and marches against the Gutian leader Tirigan. His victory inscription, preserved in later copies, records the campaign with striking confidence. He claims the gods Inanna and Ishka marched at his side, that Tirigan fled and was captured in the plain. For a brief moment, Uruk stands sovereign again, its own king on its own throne, the Eanna precinct's goddess credited with liberation. The independence lasts perhaps 7 years. Ur-Nammu, originally Utu-Hegel's governor at Ur, seizes power around 2112 before the Common Era, and founds the third dynasty of Ur. Uruk is absorbed, not destroyed, not sacked, but folded into the most administratively sophisticated state Mesopotamia has yet produced. The Ur Third Dynasty governs through a staggering volume of cuneiform paperwork. Tens of thousands of administrative tablets survive from this period across southern Mesopotamia, documenting everything. How many reeds were cut from which marsh, how many sheep were sheared in which month, how many liters of barley beer were brewed for which festival. Uruk under Ur Third Dynasty rule remains a major cult center. The Eanna receives royal patronage. Temples are maintained, rebuilt, expanded. The city's population likely holds in the tens of thousands, sustained by the same canal-fed fields that have operated for over a millennium. But the white crust on those fields has not stopped accumulating. Agricultural texts from this period across southern Mesopotamia show barley yields declining in some districts, and wheat, less salt-tolerant, disappearing from regions where it once thrived. The engine still turns, but its fuel is thinning. The Third Dynasty collapses around 2004 before the Common Era under combined pressure from Amorite migrations and Elamite invasion. The last king, Ibisin, watches his provinces peel away one by one as grain shipments fail and garrisons go unpaid. Itself falls to the Elamites. Uruk survives the transition, as it has survived every transition, its temples too important to abandon, its canals still carrying enough water to justify habitation. But the city that once held perhaps 80,000 people is contracting. Districts at the periphery show thinner occupation layers. The walls attributed to Gilgamesh still stand, enclosing 5.5 square kilometers, but the space within them is no longer full. The Isin-Lhasa period dawns over a city that endures not by growing, but by remembering what it was. Remembering is itself a kind of labor, and Uruk performs it with stubborn precision through a millennium that offers the city little else. The Isin-Lhasa period, stretching roughly from 2004 to 1894 before the Common Era, sees southern Mesopotamia fracture into competing city-states once more, each claiming the prestige of the vanished III dynasty. Isin seizes the mantle first, then Lhasa challenges from the south. Uruk sits between them, a prize traded back and forth, its political sovereignty a memory, but its sacred precincts still functioning. The Iana compound receives repairs under Isin dynasty patronage. Offerings still arrive at the altars of Ishtar, the Akkadian name now increasingly used for the goddess the Sumerians called Inanna. The cult endures because the cult is the city's reason for existing. Old Babylonian administrative texts recovered from Uruk's levels document a settlement that has reorganized itself around a contracted core. Where the early dynastic city filled its 5.5 square kilometers with dense courtyard housing, the Uruk of the early second millennium occupies perhaps a third of that space. Peripheral neighborhoods stand partially abandoned, their mud brick walls softening back into the earth they were made from. Rain and wind do the work slowly. Within a generation, an empty house becomes a low ridge. Within a century, it becomes indistinguishable from the plain. Yet the inhabited core remains active. Temple records show land leases, barley loans at standard interest of 33.33%, and lists of personnel attached to the Iana estate. Weavers, brewers, doorkeepers, and singers appear in the rosters. The temple economy has not vanished. It has simply shrunk to match a smaller population, perhaps 10 to 15,000 at most, though no census survives to confirm the figure. Hammurabi of Babylon conquers the south around 1761 before the Common Era, absorbing Uruk into an empire administered from the north. His famous law code, inscribed on a diorite stele, addresses many of the same economic tensions Uruk has known for centuries: debt, land tenure, irrigation rights. Under Babylonian rule, the city's political voice falls nearly silent in the surviving record. It appears in administrative lists as a provincial center, taxed and governed, but no longer governing. The Kassite dynasty, which takes Babylon around 1595 before the Common Era after the Hittite raid, rules for over 4 centuries. Uruk under the Kassites is documented primarily through temple maintenance records and boundary stones called kudurus that confirm land grants to the Iana estate. The Kassites, originally outsiders from the Zagros highlands, adopt Mesopotamian religious traditions with conspicuous devotion. They rebuild and endow temples across the south, and Uruk benefits. The Iana precinct receives new construction, modest compared to the cone mosaic glories of 3,000 years earlier, but sufficient to keep the sacred compound operational. The fields around the city still produce barley, though yields have declined further. Soil studies from the southern alluvium show salt concentrations rising steadily through the second millennium. Farmers compensate by leaving fields fallow longer, by shifting cultivation to less affected plots, by accepting smaller harvests. The canal system requires constant maintenance, dredging silt, repairing breaches, negotiating water shares with upstream settlements. When central authority weakens, as it does repeatedly during Kassite dynastic disputes, the canals suffer first. By 1200 before the Common Era, the Kassite dynasty collapses under Elamite assault. The famous statue of Marduk is carried off from Babylon. Uruk weathers this upheaval as it has weathered every upheaval, not by fighting, but by persisting. The Iana precinct remains consecrated ground. Priests still recite liturgies in Sumerian, a language no one speaks in daily life anymore, preserved only in ritual and scholarship. The city has become a place where the past is professionally maintained. As the second millennium closes, Uruk is smaller, quieter, and poorer than at any point since its founding. Perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people live within or near the old walls. The ziggurat still rises above the plain, visible for kilometers in every direction, a landmark that passing travelers use for orientation without necessarily knowing what it signifies. But inside the Iana, scribes still press cuneiform into clay. The tablets accumulate in temple archives, recording not conquest or glory, but rents, rations, and the names of gods. The city breathes, and far to the north, a new Babylonian ambition is stirring that will, improbably, bring Uruk one more season of renewal. That new Babylonian ambition arrives wearing the name of Nabopolassar, and then his son Nebuchadnezzar, and for the first time in centuries, the political winds blow warmth toward the old temples of the south. But before tracing that revival, the story must pause and look at what has always threatened Uruk from within. Not armies on the horizon, but the quiet, recurring catastrophes that no wall could stop. Every city built from earth carries a fundamental fragility. Mud brick, sun-dried and stacked, dissolves in sustained rain. Reed roofing, bundled and layered with bitumen, burns. The excavation record at Waka tells this story in cross-section. Layer after layer of collapsed walls, ash deposits, and deliberate leveling where ruined structures were flattened to become foundations for the next generation. Archaeologists count these rebuilding horizons across 3 millennia. The city did not simply stand, it was perpetually remade. Fire was the most sudden destroyer. Reed bundles that roofed houses and lined interior walls could carry flame from one compound to the next in minutes. Night was worst. Cooking fires left unattended, oil lamps tipped in sleep. The glow would be visible from the fields. Excavation layers from the early dynastic and old Babylonian periods preserve bands of ash and heat-reddened mud brick, evidence of conflagrations that consumed entire neighborhoods. Rebuilding followed the same pattern each time. Rubble leveled, new walls raised on the compacted debris, the street level rising another half meter. Flooding struck differently. Canal breaches during high water sent the Euphrates into districts built at or below the waterline. Mud brick walls, soaked at their base, softened and buckled. Drainage channels cut into streets and courtyards appear in excavation plans, the city's engineered response never fully adequate. A single major breach could render a residential quarter uninhabitable for a season. Disease moved through these dense quarters with efficiency that the inhabitants understood in terms of divine anger and demonic presence. Medical and omen texts from Mesopotamian archives describe epidemics sweeping through cities, fevers that emptied households, afflictions that closed markets. Incantation priests recited formulas, physicians applied poultices of herbs and mineral compounds. The therapeutic texts are detailed and systematic, evidence of genuine empirical observation wrapped in ritual language. But density was the underlying problem. Tens of thousands sharing canal water, living wall to wall in courtyard houses with open drains running to the street. The conditions for epidemic transmission were structural. Debt was slower than fire and quieter than plague, but equally destructive. Mesopotamian legal archives document families pledging their labor, then their children's labor, against loans of silver or barley they could not repay. The laws of Hammurabi, composed around 1750 before the Common Era, attempted to limit debt servitude to 3 years, evidence that the practice had become severe enough to threaten social stability. Tablets from southern cities record creditors accumulating claims on land and labor that concentrated wealth in fewer hands across generations. A family that lost its field to debt lost its place in the ration economy entirely. Uruk endured all of these simultaneously, across every century of its existence. The archaeological evidence is not dramatic, it is repetitive. Ash, then new walls. Flood silt, then raised floors. Abandoned houses in one district, new construction in another. The city contracted and expanded like breathing, its population shifting within the vast perimeter of walls built for a larger age. By the late second millennium, whole sectors inside the 9.5-kilometer circuit lay empty, their mud brick slowly weathering back into the earth from which it was shaped. Yet the Iana precinct endured every cycle. Temples were rebuilt more carefully than houses, their platforms raised higher, their walls thicker. The institution outlasted the individuals who served it. Scribes recorded damage and repair with the same meticulous accounting they applied to barley and wool. The temple was the city's memory, its treasury, and its immune system, the structure that organized recovery after each crisis, redistributing stored grain when harvests failed, mobilizing labor when walls collapsed. This resilience was not heroic, it was administrative. And it is legible today only because the same fragile clay that crumbled in floodwater also preserved, when buried and dried, the tablets that recorded every loss and every rebuilding. The mounds of Warka are not ruins in the ordinary sense. They are compressed centuries of collapse and renewal, each layer a chapter in the longest continuous urban experiment the ancient world produced. Somewhere in those layers, the Neo-Babylonian rebuilding is about to begin. Nebuchadnezzar's builders arrive at the Iana precinct sometime in the early 6th century before the Common Era, and what they find is a temple complex that has been patched, shored up, and partially rebuilt so many times that the mud brick walls carry the compressed memory of 2,000 years of maintenance. They do not demolish, they encase. New walls of superior brickwork rise around the old cores, widening foundations, raising platforms, restoring the sacred geometry that subsidence and time had slowly distorted. The Iana under Neo-Babylonian patronage becomes once again a monumental compound, courtyards repaved, storerooms expanded, the cult of Ishtar endowed with agricultural estates whose yields are measured in thousands of kuru of barley and dates. The archive tablets from this period number in the thousands, and they reveal an economy operating not on barter, but on silver by weight. A shekel of silver buys roughly 1 kuru of barley in a normal year, perhaps 180 litres. Temple administrators with documented names, men like Nabu Aheddin and his successors, manage land leases, canal maintenance contracts, livestock inventories, and the wages of weavers, brewers, and canal diggers. Brewing contracts specify quantities of dates and barley allocated for temple beer production, the same sacred beverage that had flowed through Uruk's rituals since the Archaic period, now accounted for in silver equivalents. When Cyrus the Great takes Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, Uruk passes under Achaemenid Persian administration with barely a disruption in its temple records. The new imperial authority does not suppress the cult. Persian period cylinder seals appear alongside traditional Babylonian administrative practices. The Iana's economic documents continue without interruption. Land is leased, rents are collected, disputes are adjudicated by temple courts. Entrepreneurial families, resembling the Murashu archive families documented at Nippur, operate as intermediaries between the temple economy and private commerce, extending credit, managing agricultural estates on behalf of absentee landlords, and accumulating modest fortunes recorded tablet by tablet. The city itself is smaller than its ancient walls suggest. Much of the 5.5 square kilometers enclosed by the old circuit lies empty or given over to gardens and date palm groves. The residential population clusters near the temple precincts, perhaps 10,000 people in a city that once held many times that number. Yet the Iana functions as a regional economic engine, collecting rents from estates scattered across the surrounding countryside, employing hundreds of dependents, and conducting silver transactions that connect Uruk to a commercial network stretching from the Mediterranean to the Iranian plateau. What the tablets do not record is equally telling. There are no royal building inscriptions from Uruk's own rulers, because there are no independent rulers. The city's identity now rests entirely on its temple, on Ishtar's ancient claim to this ground, on the scribal tradition that preserves rituals whose language is already archaic, on the economic machinery that transforms dates and barley and wool into silver and redistributes it according to hierarchies documented on clay. The temple is landlord, employer, bank, and court. Its administrative calendar organizes the agricultural year. Its festivals, the sacred marriage rite, the New Year processions, still draw pilgrims and participants from the surrounding region. Silver weighed on bronze scales in a temple courtyard, the soft click of weights settling into balance pans, a scribe pressing a reed stylus into fresh clay to record the transaction. This is the sound of Uruk's late revival. Not the roar of a great capital, but the steady, competent hum of an institution that has outlived every dynasty that ever claimed it. Somewhere beyond the Persian Empire's western frontier, a Macedonian kingdom is gathering strength. Alexander's army never reaches Uruk. The Macedonian conquest sweeps through Mesopotamia after 331 before the Common Era, toppling the Achaemenid order, but the southern alluvial plain is a backwater to generals racing toward Persepolis and the eastern frontiers. What arrives instead is a new calendar, a new royal administration headquartered far to the north at Seleucia on the Tigris, and, improbably, the conditions for one last intellectual flourishing inside walls that are now nearly 3,000 years old. The Seleucid kings who inherit Alexander's eastern territories recognize the political value of Babylonian temple institutions. They do not dismantle them. Royal grants flow south, and at Uruk the response is monumental. The Bit Resh sanctuary, dedicated to the sky god Anu and his consort Antu, rises in the late 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era on a scale that rivals anything the Iana precinct produced in its greatest periods. Its central courtyard stretches roughly 55 meters on a side. Nearby, the Irigal temple complex serves the goddess Ishtar, heir to Inanna's ancient cult. These are not nostalgic restorations. They are ambitious new constructions built with fired brick and bitumen mortar, engineered to last. Yet walk 3 blocks from the Bit Resh and the residential quarters thin. Houses stand empty. Streets that once pressed shoulder to shoulder now open onto vacant lots where mud brick has slumped back into earth. The countryside beyond the walls tells the same story more starkly. Canals that once fed hundreds of square kilometers of barley fields are narrowing, some already abandoned, their banks crumbling. The population that sustains the temples is a fraction of what it was a millennium earlier. Inside those temples, however, something extraordinary is happening. Families of scholars, the lineage of Anu Belshunu and his descendants, including Anu Abba Uta, produce cuneiform tablets of stunning mathematical sophistication. They track the movements of Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and the Moon across years and decades, recording observations and computing predictions using arithmetic methods that modern historians of science recognize as genuinely original. These are not casual sky watchers. Their tablets contain columns of sexagesimal numbers, base 60 calculations, predicting lunar eclipses, planetary stations, and first and last visibilities with remarkable accuracy. Hundreds of these astronomical tablets survive from Seleucid Uruk, forming one of the richest archives of ancient scientific thought ever recovered. The scholars write in cuneiform on clay, the same medium their predecessors used 3,000 years earlier to count barley rations. But the signs they press into wet clay now encode planetary periods and mathematical constants. The city that invented writing to manage grain has refined that invention into a tool for mapping the heavens. On clear nights, a temple astronomer climbs to the Bit Resh roof, and the flat horizon of the alluvial plain offers an unobstructed view in every direction. The same flatness that once made irrigation easy now makes observation precise. The contrast is almost unbearable. The temples gleam with fresh construction. The astronomical tablets represent knowledge at its most refined, and the city around them is quietly dying. The Euphrates channels that feed the remaining canals are shifting westward, and no Seleucid governor invests in the massive hydraulic maintenance that once kept the southern plain productive. Fewer farmers mean less surplus. Less surplus means fewer mouths the temple economy can feed. The scholars who compute Jupiter's synodic period to within minutes of the modern value do so in a city that can no longer fill its own streets. A dated tablet from the Bit Resh archive records a ritual for the Akitu festival, the New Year ceremony, performed with full liturgical precision. Incense burns in the sanctuary. Hymns to Anu are chanted in Sumerian, a language no one has spoken natively for more than 1,000 years, preserved only in these temple schools. The ceremony proceeds as if the city were eternal. Outside, the wind carries fine dust through neighborhoods where no one has lived for a generation. The canals grow shallower with each season that passes without dredging. The canals grow shallower. That single fact, repeated across decades, decides everything. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Euphrates has been migrating westward for generations, a geological process indifferent to ritual calendars and temple endowments. The main channel that once fed the network of secondary canals, sustaining Uruk's agricultural hinterland, now runs several kilometers from its old course. Maintaining the connection requires constant dredging, the organized mobilization of hundreds of laborers clearing silt from channels that stretch across flat, salt-crusted earth. Under the Seleucid administration, this work still happened. Under the Parthians, who absorbed southern Mesopotamia around 138 before the Common Era, the institutional will to maintain it falters. The Parthian Empire governs from Ctesiphon, far to the north. Uruk is peripheral, a temple town in a province that generates diminishing revenue. The archaeology tells the story in pottery and architecture. Parthian period occupation layers at Warka show settlement contracting to a fraction of the walled area. The great Bit Resh sanctuary still stands, its massive walls intact, but residential quarters that once pressed against the temple precincts lie empty. Excavators found Parthian-era green-glazed pottery concentrated in a small zone near the sacred compounds, suggesting a population of perhaps a few thousand at most, rattling inside walls built for tens of thousands. The streets beyond this inhabited core fill with wind-blown sand and collapsed mud brick, the organic process by which an abandoned neighborhood becomes a low mound indistinguishable from the plain. The scribes persist longer than the city around them. Cuneiform tablets from Uruk dated to the Parthian period include astronomical diaries and ritual texts, the final products of a scholarly tradition stretching back 3,000 years. The last securely dated cuneiform tablet from anywhere in Mesopotamia comes from Babylon, around 75 of the Common Era, but Uruk's own cuneiform output likely ceases within decades of that date. These final scribes write in a language and a script that the surrounding world has abandoned entirely. Aramaic has been the spoken tongue for centuries. Greek serves as the administrative language of the educated. Cuneiform survives only inside temple schools where aging scholars teach younger men a system of knowledge that has no audience beyond these walls. The water table drops. Fields that once yielded barley go fallow, then revert to desert scrub. Salt deposits whiten the surface of land that supported cultivation for 3 millennia. Without agricultural surplus, the temple economy that defined Uruk from its very origins cannot function. There are no rations to distribute because there is no grain to collect. The beveled rim bowl, mass-produced for over 1,000 years as the standard ration vessel, has long since disappeared from the archaeological record, but now the system it represented finally dies in substance as well as form. No army sacks the city, no fire sweeps through its districts, no plague empties its houses in a single season. The process is quieter and more absolute than any catastrophe. Families leave for towns closer to functioning canals. Merchants redirect their routes. The temple staff shrinks until ceremonies can barely be performed. At some point in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, the last permanent residents depart, and the only visitors are occasional herders sheltering against the massive walls that still rise above the plain. The ziggurat of Anu stands against the sky, its mud brick courses already softening under wind and rain. The Eanna precinct, rebuilt and adorned by every dynasty from Uruk's founding to the Seleucids, begins its long dissolution into the earth from which it was made. Clay tablets lie buried in collapsed rooms, sealed by rubble and dry air, waiting. The city that invented writing falls silent, but its voice is preserved in the very medium it created. Baked clay, nearly indestructible, carrying signs that will remain legible when someone finally learns to read them again. The desert closes over the tells of Warka, and the wind begins the slow work of reshaping the first great city into a series of low mounds on a featureless plain, indistinguishable to any passing traveler from the natural landscape itself. For 15 centuries, no one speaks the name. The mounds of Warka sit on the southern Mesopotamian plain under a sky that offers no shade, no mercy, and no memory. Rain falls perhaps 10 centimeters a year, sometimes less. It is enough to soften the upper courses of mud brick walls each winter. Then the summer heat bakes the loosened clay into a new surface, slightly lower, slightly rounder than before. Century by century, the ziggurat of Anu loses its edges. The sharp corners that Seleucid masons dressed with fired brick dissolve into slopes. The great Bit Resh sanctuary, still standing to considerable height when the last inhabitants departed, sheds its plaster skin in flakes that the wind carries south toward the old marshes. The process is patient and total. A mud brick wall 1 meter thick loses perhaps a centimeter of height per decade to this cycle of wetting and drying. Over 1,000 years, that is a meter gone. Over 1,500, the smaller structures vanish entirely, their material redistributed as a thin layer of clay dust across the surrounding desert. What preserves the city is the same material that destroys its silhouette. Collapsed walls bury the rooms beneath them. Fallen roofs seal doorways. Clay tablets, fired or sun-dried, lie under meters of protective rubble in conditions so arid that even unfired tablets survive intact, their reed stylus impressions as crisp as the morning they were written. The desert is simultaneously erasing and archiving. Local populations, Arab tribes moving through the region with flocks, know the mounds. The tells are landmarks in flat country, useful for orientation, sometimes for shelter from wind. But the connection between these eroded hills and any named civilization has been severed completely. No continuous oral tradition links the Bedouin camps of the 8th or 12th century of the Common Era to the temple astronomers who last occupied these buildings. The name Warka itself may descend from Uruk through Aramaic transmission, a linguistic fossil surviving without its meaning. Arab geographers of the medieval period occasionally note ruins in southern Iraq. The 10th century writer Ibn Hawqal describes the region between Basra and Kufa, but gives no special attention to any mound that can be confidently identified as Warka. The great traveler Ibn Battuta passes through southern Iraq in the 14th century without recording a visit. The ruins are not secret, they are simply unreadable. Without cuneiform, Without the institutional memory that connected later Babylonian scholars to their Sumerian predecessors, the mounds are mute earth. Meanwhile, the landscape itself transforms. The Euphrates continues its westward migration, and the old canal networks that once laced the plain around Uruk become dry depressions, then faint lines visible only from elevation, then nothing. The marshes to the south fluctuate with the river's moods, but no longer connect to any urban water system. Tamarisk and camel thorn colonize the abandoned canal beds. Foxes and jackals den in hollows that were once temple storerooms. Owls nest in cavities where cone mosaics still cling to buried walls, unseen. European awareness of Mesopotamian ruins begins slowly. 16th and 17th century travelers to Baghdad and Basra mention ancient mounds, but rarely venture into the dangerous, sparsely populated south. The tells of Walker wait through the Ottoman centuries, through tribal conflicts, through seasons of dust storms that strip one surface and deposit another. Occasionally, a heavy rain cuts a gully through a mound and exposes a wall face or a scatter of pottery sherds. Beveled rim bowl fragments, perhaps 5,000 years old, lying on the surface for a season before being buried again. By the 1840s, European interest in Mesopotamian antiquity is intensifying. Austen Henry Layard is digging at Nimrud and Nineveh in the north, pulling Assyrian reliefs from the earth. The south remains largely unexplored. Then, in 1849, William Kennett Loftus, a British geologist and naturalist attached to a boundary commission, travels to the mounds of Waka. He sees walls of enormous extent rising from the flat plain, traces the outline of a vast enclosure, and sketches what he recognizes as architecture on a scale that suggests a major ancient city. He excavates briefly, recovers inscribed bricks and clay cones, and publishes his observations. He does not yet know that he is standing on the oldest city in the world. But the silence is about to break. The tablets beneath his feet hold a voice that has been waiting, perfectly preserved in dry clay, for 2,000 years. Loftus departs, and the mounds return to silence. For more than 60 years after his brief visit, Waka receives no sustained excavation. European archaeology pours its energy into Assyrian palaces in the north, into Egyptian tombs, into the tells of Babylonia closer to Baghdad. The southern Iraqi desert, roadless and remote, guards its secrets behind heat, distance, and the reluctance of Ottoman authorities to grant permits for sites so far from any modern settlement. Then, in 1912, the German Oriental Society sends an expedition south. The team, initially led by Julius Jordan, begins systematic trenching into the mounds that Loftus had only sketched. What they uncover in the first seasons defies expectation. Beneath meters of wind-deposited sand and collapsed mud brick, the walls of monumental buildings emerge. Not the palaces of kings, but the precincts of temples, built on a scale that rivals anything known from later Mesopotamian capitals. The cone mosaic courtyards appear, tens of thousands of small clay cones, their ends painted red, white, and black, still pressed into plaster walls in geometric patterns that have held their color for 5,000 years. The excavators realize they are looking at architecture older than the pyramids. The First World War halts everything. The dig resumes in 1928, and the discoveries accelerate. In the winter season of 1933-34, the team recovers the Waka vase from the Iana precinct, a meter-tall alabaster vessel carved with registers showing water, grain, livestock, and a procession bearing offerings to Inanna. It is the oldest known narrative relief sculpture in the world. Nearby they find the Waka mask, a near-life-size marble face, probably once fitted to a wooden cult statue, its features so refined that it seems impossible for its age, roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era. But the most consequential finds are the smallest. From deep archaic levels, excavators recover clay tablets, thousands of them, bearing the earliest known writing. Approximately 5,000 tablets and fragments emerge over successive seasons, their surfaces covered in proto-cuneiform signs that record barley quantities, livestock counts, labor assignments, and commodity transfers. These are not literature. They are receipts, ledgers, institutional accounts. The realization settles slowly across the scholarly world. Writing was not invented to record poetry or royal deeds. It was invented here, in this city, to count grain. The Second World War interrupts again. German teams return in 1954 and continue through decades of further campaigns, peeling back layer after layer of the Iana and Anu precincts, mapping the 9.5-kilometer wall circuit, documenting the ziggurat's eroded core. Each season refines the chronology, pushing Uruk's urban origins deeper into the 4th millennium before the Common Era. Then comes 2003. During the conflict that sweeps through Iraq, the site of Waka suffers extensive looting. Trenches are dug illegally into unexcavated areas, and artifacts disappear into the antiquities market. The Waka vase itself, stolen from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad during the looting of April 2003, is eventually returned, broken into 14 pieces but recoverable. The mask is also taken and later recovered. International efforts follow. The site receives protected status, and Iraqi authorities and foreign partners work to secure the perimeter. Satellite imagery documents the scale of looting pits scarring the mounds. Today the tells of Waka stand behind fencing in the Muthanna province, visited by few. The archaic tablets sit in museums in Baghdad and Berlin, still being deciphered, still yielding new sign readings and institutional details. Every season of study adds another line to the ledger of the world's first city. And somewhere in the unexcavated portions of the mounds, estimated at more than 80% of the total site area, more tablets wait in dry clay, holding voices that have not yet been heard. The Waka mask rests in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad behind glass that catches the overhead light and throws it back. The face is 5,000 years old, carved from white marble that was never local to the plain, and the empty eye sockets once held inlays of shell and lapis lazuli that made the gaze feel alive. It is a face without a name. No inscription identifies it as goddess or priestess, and that silence is itself a kind of testimony. Uruk speaks not through the voices of its kings, but through the objects its institutions produced, counted, stored, and occasionally lost in the rubble of rebuilding. What the excavations proved, across more than a century of work, is that this city did not merely precede other cities. It invented the apparatus that made cities possible. The archaic tablets, numbering roughly 5,000, are not literature. They are receipts. They record barley distributed in measured quantities, livestock counted by type and age, labor assigned by days and tasks. The system demanded standardization, and standardization produced the beveled rim bowl, found in archaeological layers by the tens of thousands, each one roughly the same capacity, each one a single serving of grain ration pressed from a mold. Before philosophy, before poetry, before law, there was accounting, and accounting required signs pressed into wet clay, and those signs became writing. The city's other inventions followed from the same institutional pressure. Mass production emerged not from market demand, but from the need to feed and equip a labor force building temples from millions of mud bricks. Monumental architecture arose because surplus grain, centrally collected, could be converted into organized human effort on a scale no village council could command. The cylinder seal, rolled across clay to mark ownership, created portable, reproducible identity, a technology whose principle survives in every digital signature. And at the end, in the Seleucid centuries, the temple scholars turned the same bureaucratic precision towards the sky, producing astronomical records accurate enough that modern historians use them to anchor ancient chronology. Gilgamesh belongs to literature. The epic that bears his name was composed centuries after the period it claims to describe, assembled from older Sumerian poems, shaped by Akkadian scribes, and preserved on tablets found not at Uruk, but at Nineveh. The real city behind the legend had no hero who sought immortality. It had canal diggers who cleared silt each season, weavers who produced textiles measured by weight for export, and scribes who recorded every transaction because the institution demanded it. The walls attributed to Gilgamesh are real, 9.5 kilometers of mud brick circuit with some 900 towers, but they were built by organized labor over generations, not by a demigod in a single reign. The question the ruins pose is not about the past alone. Uruk thrived for 3,000 years on irrigated surplus, and irrigated surplus deposited salt in the soil with every season of watering, and salt slowly reduced the yields the entire system required. The city did not fall to an enemy. It fell to the cumulative cost of its own engine. The Euphrates shifted, the canals silted, the fields whitened, and the people walked away, family by family, until only the temples stood empty against the sky. More than 80% of the site remains unexcavated. Beneath the mounds of Waka, in dry clay that preserves what wetter climates would have dissolved, more tablets wait. Each one is a line in the longest urban biography on Earth, written by the city that taught humanity to write at all. Thank you for joining this journey through the life of the world's first great city. If these stories have brought the ancient world a little closer, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city whose ruins still have something to say.